Blackout. The first time I met Leo Seva, the entire city was falling apart, and he was already underwater, racing against water pressure, and a closing structural window to retrieve salvage equipment from beneath the Bay Bridge, while I was standing on the bridge deck, calculating whether the supports would hold long enough for him to get out alive. My name is Karim Farhan. I'm 25 years old, Syrian American, and I work as a structural integrity inspector for the San Francisco Bay Area Infrastructure Authority. I was born in Aleppo, moved to the States when I was 8, and spent my entire career learning to read buildings the way other people read faces, understanding their stress points, their weaknesses, the precise moment when the mathematics of load distribution becomes the physics of collapse. But on March 12th, the San Francisco Bay Bridge stopped being an academic problem and became a survival equation. The earthquake registered 6.8 on the Richter scale. It lasted 43 seconds. In that time, the northern suspension cables of the Bay Bridge sustained structural compromise that preliminary assessments suggested was catastrophic. I was in the emergency response center when the seismic data came through, and I saw the numbers before anyone else understood what they meant. The bridge was going to fail. Not maybe, not possibly. The mathematical models were screaming it. The evacuation order went out at 2:47 p.m. By 3:15 p.m., the bridge was empty. By 3:30 p.m., I was standing on the deck with measurement equipment, running calculations that I hoped were wrong but knew were right, when I heard the radio transmission, salvage team requesting access to lower bay grid. We've got diving equipment in the storage facility beneath the west approach. If we don't recover the instruments before structural failure, 6 months of research data goes down with the bridge. My supervisor's response was immediate, negative, no personnel access, evacuation is mandatory. But then I heard a different voice, calm, confident, devastatingly calm. With respect, ma'am, those instruments are irreplaceable. Give me 20 minutes. I can get in and out before no. My supervisor cut him off. Structural failure is imminent. You will not access that area. I made a decision that probably should have required approval from someone much higher up the chain of command. I opened the channel myself and said, "This is Karim Farhan, structural inspector, badge 4417. I can calculate the exact evacuation window. If the diver is fast enough, it's possible." There was silence. "Then copy that, inspector. Stand by." 5 minutes later, Leo Seva appeared on the bridge deck, and I understood immediately why he was willing to risk his life for equipment, because he moved with the kind of focus and precision that comes from someone who's dedicated their existence to something they believe in. He was tall, probably 6'3", with deep brown Samoan features, dark eyes that held intelligence underneath the casual confidence, and he was carrying diving equipment like it weighed nothing, which meant his body was as focused as his mind. "Inspector Farhan," he said. "That's me," I replied. "The structural compromise is concentrated in the northern suspension cables and the main span cross-bracing. The loading stress is cascading toward the approach supports where your equipment is stored. I've modeled the degradation rate. You have approximately 18 minutes before the support structure becomes unstable enough that the entire lower bay grid shifts. Movement of that magnitude will trap you." Leo didn't look scared. He looked focused. 18 minutes, he repeated. "That's good. I usually need 12 to 7. "This isn't usually," I said. "This is an earthquake with ongoing aftershocks and structural materials that are actively failing. You're not diving through stable water. You're diving through a location that's actively becoming more dangerous every second." "I understand the risk," Leo said. He was already moving toward the access point. "How will I know when the window's closing?" "I'll be monitoring the structural stress sensors. When the indicators reach critical threshold, I'll notify you. You'll have approximately 90 seconds to evacuate. If you're not out of the water by then, the shift will trap you in the access tunnel." Leo looked at me directly. "And how accurate are your calculations?" It was a fair question. It was the question that mattered. Because if my calculations were wrong, if my modeling was imprecise, if there was any error in my mathematical framework, Leo would die underwater while I watched from the deck. 96%, I said. Over 15 years of structural assessment work, my calculations have been verified and re-verified by the San Francisco engineering community. I'm as accurate as any human in this field can be. Leo smiled, not nervously, genuinely. Then I trust you, Inspector. 96% is better odds than I usually get. He was already in the water. The next 18 minutes were the longest of my life. I was standing on the bridge deck with monitoring equipment, watching the real-time stress sensors, calculating the cascade failure rate, checking and rechecking my mathematics, while Leo was 70 feet below the surface in darkness and crushing pressure, retrieving the equipment that his research team had stored months earlier. The radio crackled. "I've got visual on the storage facility." Leo's voice came through, slightly compressed by the water communication system. "Equipment intact. Beginning retrieval sequence." "Copy," I said. "You're at 3 minutes elapsed. Stress indicators are rising. You're good." But already I could see the numbers changing. The secondary cross-bracing was experiencing load redistribution. The compression on the suspension cables was increasing. It was happening faster than my initial modeling had predicted, which meant either my calculations had an error or the structural damage was more severe than the preliminary assessment suggested. "Stress increasing," I reported. "Increased retrieval speed. You've got approximately 12 minutes now, not 18. "Copy that," Leo said. His voice was still calm. He was moving faster. I could hear the urgency in his breathing, the controlled panic of someone who understood they were racing against time in a literally crushing environment. I was updating my calculations in real time now, running new models based on the live sensor data, adjusting my predictions, trying to account for variables I hadn't anticipated. The problem with structural engineering in a crisis is that all your theoretical knowledge becomes irrelevant when the building, or in this case the bridge, is actually failing in front of you. "How much equipment?" I asked. "3 sealed containers. I've got 2. Going for the 3rd now." "You don't have time," I said. The numbers were screaming at me. The cascade failure was accelerating. "Retrieve 2. Get out of the water." "1 more minute," Leo said. "I can get the 3rd. "No," I said. "The stress numbers are critical. You need to leave now." "That's not a suggestion. That's a structural fact." There was a pause. Then "Copy. Evacuating with 2 containers." I heard the sound of movement, the rush of water through the communication system, the controlled urgency of Leo ascending through the water column while the entire support structure around him began to shift. The alarm on my monitoring equipment started screaming, not metaphorically, literally screaming. The secondary bracing had reached critical stress. The load redistribution was occurring faster than my models had predicted. The collapse sequence was beginning. "Leo, you need to move now. This is not a drill. Structural failure is occurring. Get to the surface." "I'm coming up." Leo's voice came through. 30 feet, 20 feet. The bridge shifted. It wasn't a collapse, not yet, but it was movement. The kind of structural shift that meant the cascading failure was no longer theoretical. It was physical reality happening in real time. The northern approach to the bridge moved maybe 2 inches, but 2 inches of movement in a suspension bridge structure is like an earthquake itself. It's catastrophic. 10 feet. Leo's voice. 5. Leo broke the surface, gasping, still holding both containers, and I was already moving, already running down the access stairs, already doing the calculations about whether the bridge would hold long enough for him to reach solid ground. "Move," I was shouting. "The bridge is failing. You need to reach the west support in 90 seconds." Or Leo was already climbing out of the water, already moving, the containers still in his hands. He ran toward the access point, dripping barely in his diving suit, and I was there with a safety harness, attaching it to the only stable structural point I could identify, helping him climb, calculating how many tons of force the attachment point could hold if the bridge decided to fail right now. The bridge made a sound like thunder, not the sound of collapse, not yet, but the sound of metal under incredible stress, of a structure beginning to fail, of physics overriding engineering. Leo reached the deck, and I grabbed his arm, and we were actually running away from the edge, toward the main support structure that I calculated was still stable, and the bridge was shifting beneath us, the movement visible now, the gap between the deck sections widening, and I was doing math in my head. calculating whether we were moving fast enough, whether the support would hold, whether my calculations about the 90-second evacuation window had been accurate, or if I just killed the most impressive person I'd ever met. We reached the main support column, and I pulled Leo against it just as the northern approach section dropped 3 feet. That's when the cascade stopped. The load that had been redistributing to the northern suspension cables suddenly had a new path through the emergency diagonal bracing that the bridge engineers had built in 1987. The cascade failed to cascade. The system found a new equilibrium. The bridge didn't collapse. It was still failing, still structurally compromised, still going to need to be closed for months of repair, but it wasn't collapsing right now with us on it. Leo and I were pressed against the support column, both breathing hard, the salvage containers still in his hands, and he was laughing, actually laughing, despite the fact that we'd nearly died. "You saved my life," he said. "You would have died if you'd gone for the third container," I replied. "Why would you even consider?" "Because the research is important," Leo said. He was still breathing hard, still dripping water, and he was looking at me with an intensity that had nothing to do with the emergency and everything to do with recognition. "And because you said I had 18 minutes, even when the calculations changed, you still got me out alive. You were calculating in real time. You adapted. You trusted your own data, and you changed your predictions when the data changed. That's not something most people can do under pressure." "It's my job," I said. "No," Leo said. "It's your gift. You understand systems. You understand how things break and how to keep them from breaking. And you trusted that I could move fast enough to make it work." He set the salvage containers down carefully. "So here's what I know. I'm Leo Savea. I'm a marine salvage diver, and I've spent 3 years acquiring research data that's going to help us understand underwater structural dynamics in ways we've never understood before. And you just risked your professional reputation and possibly your life to keep me from dying while recovering that research. That's not just structural engineering. That's something else. I should have said something professional. I should have maintained the boundary between inspector and civilian. But instead I said, 'Are you seeing anyone?' Leo looked at me, and I watched the realization cross his face, the same realization I was having. That in the last 20 minutes we'd built a trust that usually takes months, that we'd worked together in a crisis, complementing each other's skills, each trusting the other's expertise completely, that the connection was as real as the failing bridge around us." "No," Leo said. "I'm not." "Good," I said. "Because what just happened, the way you trusted my calculations, the way I trusted you to move fast enough, the way we worked together while everything was falling apart, that's not a professional partnership. That's something else." Leo reached over and took my hand. Just took it. Straightforward, simple, impossible to misinterpret. "Kiss me," he said, "before emergency response arrives and the bridge gets evacuated again." So I did. It was desperate and urgent, and tasted like adrenaline and salt water and the specific electricity of two people who just survived something impossible together and come out on the other side understanding each other in a way that usually takes months to build. Leo's hand came up to my face, the one not holding the salvage container, and I felt the cold water still dripping from his hair, and that small detail made the moment even more real, more grounded in the specific reality of who we were. Two people who understood systems. Two people who'd learned that the most powerful force in the world wasn't structural engineering or water pressure. It was human connection. The siren started. Emergency response. The evacuation order was being reinforced. The bridge was officially closed, and everyone not essential to structural assessment needed to be off the deck. Leo pulled away reluctantly. "I should get these containers secured," he said. "The research data needs to be protected." "Come with me," I said. "I need to file my structural assessment anyway. We can both finish here and then." The next 48 hours were a blur of engineering assessments, emergency meetings, structural calculations, and bureaucracy. But they were also 48 hours of Leo and me working together in the Structural Assessment Center, combining his knowledge of underwater dynamics with my calculations of load distribution, creating a comprehensive assessment of the bridge's state that was published in preliminary form and immediately became the reference for the emergency repair work. We were a good team, not just because we complemented each other's skills, but because we thought in similar ways. Leo would look at a water pressure problem and see the structural implication. I would look at a support calculation and understand how water dynamics affected the integrity. We weren't competing for the right answer. We were collaborating toward understanding. But more than that, we were learning each other. Leo learned that I needed silence during intensive calculation sessions, but also needed reassurance that I wasn't being too obsessive. I learned that Leo had a photographic memory for spatial relationships, but second-guessed his instincts constantly. By the time the preliminary structural assessment was complete, we'd also completed what I can only describe as a detailed character study of each other. We knew each other's coffee preferences, our working styles, the specific ways we panicked under pressure, the things we were passionate about. Leo told me about his research, about marine salvage operations, and the structures at the bottom of the bay, and how understanding underwater dynamics could inform better building design for earthquake-prone regions. I told him about structural engineering and the obsessive precision it required, and how I sometimes couldn't stop calculating the load-bearing capacity of every building I entered. You know that's not normal, right? Leo said to me one morning in the assessment center, both of us running on our 5th coffee of the day. I know, I said, but it's who I am. I see buildings, and I see systems. I see the stress points. I understand failure modes intuitively. That's not normal, Leo repeated. That's beautiful, and I want to understand how your mind works for the rest of my life. 6 months later, we were sitting on the repaired Bay Bridge, the public reopening ceremony having concluded, the structural integrity assessment having been officially cleared, the crisis resolved, and the bridge transformed from a failing structure into a symbol of collaborative engineering. Leo had moved to San Francisco officially. He'd taken a permanent position with the San Francisco Bay Area Underwater Research Institute, the same institution that had owned the salvage equipment we'd recovered during the earthquake. His work was now featured in engineering textbooks. My structural assessment was published in 3 major journals. But more importantly, we'd built a life together. We'd moved into an apartment in the Mission District with a clear view of the bay. We cooked together. We went to engineering conferences together. We were quite simply completely integrated into each other's existence. I have a question for you, Leo said on the bridge, at sunset, with the entire city of San Francisco spread out beneath us. Are you seeing anyone? I asked before he could finish. Leo laughed. That's not the question, but I'll answer it. I'm only seeing you, only thinking about you, only want to build my future with you. He produced a ring, handmade, he told me later, by an artisan who worked with salvaged materials from underwater structures. It was titanium and iron, materials that came from things that had been broken and were now being transformed into something new. It was perfect. Will you marry me? Leo asked. Will you spend your life with someone who understands that trust isn't about certainty, it's about knowing that the other person will calculate in real time, will adapt when conditions change, will trust your expertise even when everything is falling apart? Yes, I said, because I already knew the answer. I'd known it the moment Leo trusted my 18-minute calculation while water pressure was crushing down on him. I'd known it when I trusted him to move fast enough to escape the collapsing bridge structure. I'd known it every moment since. Epilogue. The security camera footage shows us from above. 2 people on the Bay Bridge kissing at sunset. The timestamp reads 6:17 p.m. on September 4th. Behind us, San Francisco spreads across the peninsula, and beyond us, the bay water catches the last light of the day. But we're not looking at the view or the city or the water. We're looking at each other. 2 people who met in a structural emergency and discovered that the most powerful force wasn't physics or mathematics or water pressure. It was the specific gravity of 2 people who'd learned that they could trust each other completely. The bridge will eventually require more repairs. The bay will continue its eternal dynamics. Systems will fail and need to be rebuilt. But we'll be there together. One person calculating the mathematics of safety, the other person understanding the intuitive dynamics of depth and pressure and risk. That's the real engineering. That's the real structural integrity. That's Karim and Leah.